please don't begin with, hey, our first Sunday back, we read a whole book of the Bible. Because you just did. And again, it's one of those interesting things about the Bible, right? We call it a book, but it really is a library of books and papers, because this book isn't really a book, it's a letter. It's a letter from Paul to a guy named Philemon. And it's such an interesting thing. It's the, by the way, it's not the shortest book of the Bible. It's the third shortest. The other two, well, I'm not going to tell you what the other two are. The two that are actually shorter than this one, because coming up in October, you should look for our short series on how we got the Bible, called Bible 101. And you should come to that and find out all of this interesting stuff about how the Bible was assembled, how we ended up with books of prophets and gospels and songs and letters. Commercial over. But this is a letter that Paul wrote to Philemon. And remember, last week or the week before, we were talking about Hebrews, the letter to the Hebrews. And I said, like, right from the very beginning, people were not sure this was actually by Paul. They were questioning it right from the beginning. And now, most biblical scholars will tell you it was definitely not written by Paul. This is the exact opposite. From the very beginning, there was no doubt in anybody's mind that this was written by Paul. And not just because it says, signed by Paul at the bottom of it, but because it tells you about a relationship that Paul has with somebody. And you know, when we read things like Corinthians or Colossians, when we read those letters, right, we talk about them and we say, okay, this is Paul's correspondence to this community that he helped found. We don't have their correspondence to him. He may have heard from other people. It might have been a letter to him or whatever it was. Here's Paul writing back in response to their concerns. This one's different. This is Paul not writing in response to a concern that came to him, but actually practically talking about something he talks about in a much more theological way in other letters. He talks about, in some of the other letters, he talks about love and care. In Corinthians especially, you know, he does talk about the relationship amongst people. Because it's challenging. One of the challenges the Corinthians had, which everybody had in the beginning, was this. How do you get a diverse bunch of people together from diverse backgrounds, different cultures, different financial situations, different appearances, different abilities? How do you get all these people to come together and be one community without there suddenly being some sort of hierarchy based on how important you may or may not be? Because we're all important, and that's the point of the church for all. It's not that we want to be everything to all people. It's that what we're open to is you being part of this community in a way that affects us. That's what a real welcome is about, right? That's what belonging is about. Feeling like you belong isn't just, oh, I fit in. It's, I bring something to this group that impacts the group, and I'm part of who that group is. Not just because I fit in, but because I bring something. So here's this letter to Philemon. Philemon, we think, was a leader in a church in Colossae. That's the letters to the Colossians, same thing. In fact, Philemon is actually mentioned elsewhere in the Bible in one of those letters as a leader of the church. It actually references home church, which is what the church started out as, right? We met in people's homes. And so the assumption is when you put all the pieces together, including the implication that Onesimus was a slave, Philemon was rich. He had a house big enough to have church in. He had a slave, at least one, and he was clearly a leader in the church. So the assumption then is that Philemon's rich and he has slaves. Okay, but that still doesn't, when we read this letter, it kind of gives the impression then, I guess, that Onesimus is not really a big deal. Philemon is a big deal. And Paul says exactly the opposite. There's been very little debate about whether or not Onesimus was, in fact, a slave, and that part of this letter is about slavery. In the first century, it was not unusual for anywhere from 40 to 50% even of the population to be enslaved in some fashion, or indentured in some fashion. And it wasn't a cultural thing. It wasn't a cultural thing. Anybody could be a slave. You get there in the usual way. You owe something. So it's entirely possible, in my thinking, that Onesimus was not a slave in the conventional sense, but in fact simply owed Philemon in some way. But whether he was a slave or he owed Philemon in some way, here's Paul saying, that doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. Receive him back just as he is. Welcome him as a brother. Welcome him as you would welcome me. Who does that sound like? Doesn't that sound like Jesus? Here's Paul being Jesus in a moment. Welcome him back the way as if he were me. Whatever happened between Onesimus and Philemon, here's Paul saying, welcome him back as if he was a brother in Jesus. You would think a leader of the church wouldn't need to be reminded of that. But again, here's Paul addressing in a very practical way the kind of thing that you can expect to happen when a community is formed. Structure develops. Equality loses, or equity loses ground to the importance of individuals, important for one reason or another. It could be that Philemon wasn't just rich, he was a good speaker. Maybe he was a good organizer. He had administrative skills. We don't know. Maybe he was just the rich guy who sat at the back and said, welcome to my house, don't put your feet on the coffee table. But the thing about this letter is that unlike the others, which give us really powerful, meaningful, deep theological messages, this one doesn't. It just simply gives us the practical statement. Welcome this person as if they were me. Welcome this person as if they were Jesus. Welcome this person as if they were simply that. And that's their value. They're a person. And if they owe you anything, that's on me. I'll take care of that. So this is another interesting thing about the letter too, is that Paul starts out, but you heard how the letter goes, right? This is Paul. Hi, you're awesome. Love what you're doing great stuff there, doing great work. By the way, there's this guy. And some thinking is, by the way, that Onesimus accidentally bumped into Paul. But it could also be that he actually sought Paul out. It could be that Onesimus was thinking, I'm not getting back in with my home church just by showing up. I need some help. I'm going to go talk to Paul. But here in this letter, you're doing great stuff. I got to ask you this one thing. But he asks it in an interesting way. He says, I could tell you, but I'm not gonna. I want you to want to do it for yourself. Does that sound familiar? That's so United Church. I'm not going to tell you what to do. You have to decide what it is for yourself. It is, isn't it? But that's the great thing about it. Is that here's Paul saying, yes, I could command you. The power of Jesus compels you. But what I want you to do is I want you to want to do it. I want you to want to welcome him back as a brother. Just as he is. A person doesn't change their attitude simply by being told they should change their attitude. True change happens when you embrace the idea. When you open your mind up to the possibility this could be different. I could do it this way, I could do this. Paul doesn't want Philemon to go, okay, we'll let you back into the club. He wants Philemon to be literally like the father in the prodigal son story, to run out onto the street, embrace Onesimus and say, welcome home. So what's the learning? What's the learning for us? As a church, as a community of faith? It's simply the very practical question that we always have to ask ourselves. How are we welcoming people? Are we simply saying, hi, welcome, here's a smile, here's a handshake, go and sit down, do what we do? Or are we inviting people to be part of our community in a way that people feel like they belong? And that's the thing about a story like A Church for All. That's the thing about having a sign on the outside of your building that says, we'll take anyone. That's the thing about having a sign that's the affirming logo. These are all ways that people should get a heads up that, yes, you're going to be welcome here. But that's not enough. It's not enough to just say or put signs up. We need the interaction. We need the embrace the person for who they are. Welcome them not only because they might fit in, but because they bring something that changes us too. That's the great thing about community, the common unity. We're not just here because we fit together well. We're here because we bring who we are. We don't get a lot of information about who Onesimus really is. We don't know what the issue was. We don't know if the issue was simply that, yes, he was a slave and he ran away, which, by the way, in the first century could get you dead. But we don't know what the issue was. We don't know what Onesimus is like. Maybe he wasn't a particularly good person. We don't know. We also don't know whether Philemon was a particularly bad person, although there's kind of an implication that Paul is kind of implying that Philemon is the kind of person who would hold a grudge. So you need to change that thinking, Philemon. Welcome him as a brother. But it shouldn't really matter, because the point of the letter is simple. Welcome as a brother. Welcome as a brother in the family of Jesus. Welcome him for who he is, whoever that is, however that is, and make them feel like they can be part of the community again. I think that's a particularly important message at this time of the year, right? Things are starting up again. People are getting involved in doing, now that we've had a nice long summer off, summer that didn't start until the middle of August. And now that we've had all of that, we're getting back at doing things. So, my question to you is, how are we really welcoming? How would you like to be welcomed? How would you share that welcome with others? You can't just go up to somebody on the street and say, hey, want to come to my church? You need to show and say why they should. Why they might not only be part of this community, but what they might also bring to this community, what they might gain from this community. All of those are pieces of the interaction that we have as a community. We need all those things. That becomes impossible when you hold a grudge against somebody because they did something in the past. That becomes impossible when you don't go and participate in something because you think you know what it's about. Right? The United Church is traditionally the church of all of the people who don't go to church. Right? How often do you hear people in a community say, oh, I don't go to the church, but if I did go to church, I'd go to the United Church. It may be true of other denominations too. I don't know. But I do know that that's a person who can be moved to discover that there might be a good reason to go. And you're only going to do that by giving them that good reason. But they're not the only ones. There's, of course, also the people who don't go to church because I am not going to church. I know what those people are about. They've already decided either what you're all about, or they've decided sitting in a pew on a Sunday morning and singing hymns from the 18th century isn't what I want to do. And that's obviously what we do. Is it? No. Those are people who need to discover. And they're only going to discover what it truly is when you share it with them. So here's Paul. Here's Paul writing a letter to Philemon. And he refers to Onesimus as my son. How Onesimus was formerly useful to you, but now he's useful. Formerly not useful to you, but now he's useful to me. And now he's useful to you because he's a brother in Jesus. The biggest part of that is the relationship. Obviously, Paul heard his story. How often do we say, how often do I say, I think there's a piece missing from that story, and I think it's a piece where Jesus sat down and listened to that person's story. That's where true healing comes from. And maybe that's where the true healing is going to come from in this story. We don't know. Onesimus could have taken the letter, gone back to see Philemon. Philemon opened the door and then slammed the door in his face. We don't know. But I wonder also if Onesimus didn't take that letter, give it to Philemon. Philemon read it and then said to Onesimus, let's talk. Here's how I think you hurt me. What do you think? Share with me what you think. This is the beginning of reconciliation, isn't it? The engagement of hearing each other's stories. And hearing them not defensively, but hearing them simply as, this is my story, it's who I am. And then from that engagement, from that sharing of stories, finding a way back to, we are brothers and sisters in the family of God. All of us together. This is such a good time of year to be hearing this, reading. Does it bother anybody else, or is it just me that we're reading personal correspondence? I mean, the letter is obviously, it's addressed not just to Philemon. Paul refers to other people. And by the way, say hi to so-and-so and hi to so-and-so. And over here, so-and-so wants to say hi to you. But it's a letter. It's a personal correspondence to Philemon about a really touchy issue. And we're reading it like it's something that should be shared with everybody. Because it should. It should. This is Paul very practically addressing what Jesus is all about. Love your neighbor, whoever your neighbor is, because everyone is your neighbor. And love them for who they are. Not how they're useful to you or not useful to you. Not based on where they are in the social standing or social structure of rented lips, the social structure of things, but for who they are. How do we welcome people? How would you like to be welcomed? How do you most feel welcome?